Okay, carrying on our conversation that we were just going through in the previous part, we talked about peer review. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the heritage structures that involve masonry. As I previously mentioned, the Toronto does have a rich history of brick and brick structures that were predominant. However, a lot of these were demolished in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s to make way for basically a downtown town torn rejuvenation. You can use that word if you want, in the city center that led a series of skyscrapers. For example, TD Plaza was one of these areas. And essentially, these smaller buildings were removed, and newer buildings with larger office space were put in their place. And you have to really consider that is actually a huge driver when you're thinking about development of a city, is not so much even just like cost of living in a downtown core, but the cost of renting out space. So if you can have a lot of units to rent out, it makes it very profitable to have a larger structure, whereas a smaller structure, there's only so much you can do. So imagine it this way: you have a two-story place, and that two-story place of business has maybe two units that can be rented out at $2,000, and these are arbitrary numbers. So the amount of money that would come in would be about $4,000. Now, if you had a skyscraper of 50 stories, you could sell maybe 50 floors, and that all of a sudden skyrockets the amount of rent that can be collected, and you can see why these larger structures come in. So preserving these more unique structures from the past becomes very difficult because the cost of living is just outrageous. So you do get denser population that is a result of that. This is a heritage structure I want to talk about first. There's more of a contemporary one. I know it's kind of weird to say it's contemporary, but contemporary meaning modern. The basis of this building is the Tate Modern, which is an arts museum. Now, for me in arts, I love painting, but my paintings are just crazy in the sense that I don't really understand the rules of art as it goes. So if you go into this place, it's not just paintings that you're seeing. The things that they're exhibiting there have a lot to do with all forms. So, for example, using acoustics as art. And that's really important when you're thinking about, from a design perspective, is how do you actually allow that type of use in a structure and get that across. So very complicated structure in the sense that the demand of the structure is to house very unique exhibits that require a lot of space, that also require a lot of consideration to lighting and also sound. In order to do that, this becomes even more complicated because the building that is used to become this museum happens to be an old decommissioned coal power plant or so. So basically, that's the Tate Modern. It is a building on the Thames River in London, England, just next to the Millennium Bridge. So it's a fascinating structure to get a chance to really see the exhibits related to it. The other really interesting thing about the structure is it's gone basically with a whole new addition that is meant to keep to the past of the structure, which is a masonry structure with a bit of concrete, and have a new addition. In this case, this addition here is a very intricate angled structure. So in order to actually facilitate the architectural vision, a series of high strength concretes would have to be used to build up the primary structural system. But the exterior system, which is not really necessarily meant to be load bearing, it's meant to be acting as what we call a rain screen. is the facade, and that is going to be very similar to the original Tate Modern that's using a brick facade, only using modern units. So on your course website, there is an article that details the structure, and you are responsible for reading that article and learning a little bit about the structural systems that are at play and how the materials are being actually used. But, we'll cover a little bit of it for you here. So the exterior masonry system of this building, the Tate Modern, or at least a new part of the addition, basically it acts as a rain screen to keep water out of the structure. And they use about 300,000 bricks to do this. And they're basically set in a corbel fashion where they're cantilevered. They also have 5 different tonal hues that are created. And in order to bond them together, the mortar is a polymerized mortar. And basically, it makes it so that these things can easily be put together so that you don't need to use any wet trades. Now, what is a wet trade? Well, a wet trade is essentially an organization that is an expert at actually assembling these types of materials with a high degree of precision. You'll see later in the slides, I'm going to show you that level of precision and why it's not just anybody can build a brick wall. There's a lot to consider. The bricks have to be precisely aligned in many cases. In this case, this relieved that aspect of needing to hire that many people. And this is essentially how the cantilever system actually comes together for this structure. So that's Tate Modern. That's more of a modern building. I love introducing this case study to you. It's a masonry building as well. This one's from the 1800s or so. This is a heritage structure. It's basically in Kilburn, also in the United Kingdom. It looks like a comfy tavern that would be popular. It is a heritage structure in the sense that it is one of the only remaining buildings that survived what was called the Blitz in World War II. The Blitz was basically sustained bombing from Germany to England during the Second World War. So there was a lot of destruction of buildings and properties. So this building survived it and basically became a very much heritage symbol within the local community in which it was around. So essentially, and correction there, it was built in the 1920s. But basically, it was unaltered since then, but it was sold in 2008 to foreign investments. And remember how I've mentioned to you is that when you only have something that has like 2 units that can be rented out and a very dense population core, keeping, or at least being able to keep these types of structures is incredibly difficult because there's going to be so much push to demolish and build something larger that can have more units. So what happens is these owners wanted to demolish the building, obviously, because they wanted to put a larger building there. So essentially, the heritage people came in and tried to get the heritage designation put on the building that it would allow alteration, but the structure had to remain. And that was basically what grade 2 meant in the United Kingdom. It still means that. So it basically says that you can't lose the building, but you can alter the interior of the building. So they basically were able to get the designations for the building, and these would take effect on April 6th. So what happened was on April 6th, the landlady of the building who was meant to maintain it was told by the owners to close on April 6th so that they could do an inventory or so. Basically take a break and come back 2 days later. So when she came back to work 2 days later to see what was the results of that inventory, this is what she came back to. Despite the designation that was put onto the building, the demolition proceeded anyway. So the viewpoint is if the viewpoint of the owners was, well, we'll just knock it down anyway. And, there's no building to have a heritage designation. You can see that pretty much everything, even on the inside, including, you can even see the mounted TV. It was just literally, they just started to demolish it. And the community was outraged. And this is very important in terms of what makes a heritage building something that will be kept with time. And it's something that I think, from my personal view, you have to consider, in that it's not just protecting everything that's old. When it comes to protecting something, you have to be protecting something that genuinely has a cultural significance to the community, that the community is willing to fight for it. And if those conditions are present, then you can preserve the heritage structure. That's my opinion of it. What happens is that if no one in the community cares for it, what happens is then you lose these buildings because nobody's going to fight for them. In this case here, what happens is they tried to demolish it, but even though they demolished it, a fight did ensue, or a fisticuff, as it's said. And essentially, the legal system came in, and the owners were then told that they had to rebuild the structure basically brick by brick. So essentially, you had a large level of community protection that was coming into play here to make sure that this building could be preserved in the future, which, is what you would see with buildings that truly define having this feature with it. So they tried to appeal. They didn't want to do it. They tried to appeal. They were told to get over it and rebuild. And essentially, by 2018, there was a degree of reconstruction, and the building has been reconstructed by 2020. Certainly community rallying for the building, and that level of preservation. Now, what you have to be very careful about is, if people are not, they don't need to tear down a building to get the building removed. What can also happen, and understanding masonry units very particular, is that they're very susceptible to freeze thaw. And if they have any level of uncontrolled heating and cooling that reacts in a cycle, it can deteriorate the building materials very aggressively. So when you walk around the city, one of the things that you'll see when you walk around the city is you might come across some heritage buildings that may look like they're in really bad shape. And in many of these cases, what happens is that they are owned by outside organizations. And what happens is they open up all the windows of the building, or they leave the taps running, or something. And what happens is you see in these heritage structures a lot of decay from freeze thaw over several years. You might also see a few fires or something that occur. And essentially what happens is the building gets into a state where it can no longer be repaired, and it's considered a hazard to the community, in which case no designation is going to save it at that point. And because it's the safety and well-being will trump the situation. So that's something that comes into play a lot when it comes to these structures. That's very important. Like I said, it really comes down to whether the community is going to rally for the structure. In this case study, this is called Harriet Ree's house. This is a fascinating one. Usually every year the students love this one, and I'll show you why in a moment. This building was a house in Chicago. It was built in 1888. And essentially it received its heritage designation around 2012, and it was the only original building still remaining from the time period. The back portion of the house also predates the Chicago fire from 1871, where most of the city was destroyed. So essentially, what is the significance of this house is, through the time it's basically weathered all the developments, and certainly has maintained its prominence. So what happened is of course another wealthy owner, this time I believe it was a university, decided that they wanted to build a sports complex. The sports complex would cost $1.1 billion. Now, the heritage designation people would say, hey, if you demolish my building, you're going to get sued. So this one was really interesting because the owner had deep pockets. What they did is they accepted the fine and just moved the building. And the moving of the building is really interesting in the sense. So the moving of the building was basically utilizing a series of different materials, and that's why I love this part of the course. Is now we begin to bring in a lot of the different materials that are happening, and you get to really see the composite behaviors of everything. So in this case, this building is shored up and essentially it's going to be lifted off the ground with a very sturdy steel network of steel beams and such. And the structure will literally be lifted off its foundations and moved down the street. You can see in these photos here this action. So essentially, at this phase of the situation, they've basically excavated and shored up the building. There's bracing to the sides of the building so that the masonry doesn't get damaged. And the plan would be is to move the building down the street. So they would have to basically reinforce the roadway so that it could take the load of the structure itself. And then they're going to back up the house into its new lot, which would be an incredibly scary parking job. So here's a video that shows the movement of the house. Isn't that just incredible? And every movement of the structure is going to be looked just to make sure that nothing happens to it. So a lot of surveying that's going to go on. Of course, it starts to rain during it. And remember, in this case, they have to close the roadway. So when you close a roadway, you have to pay an additional fine or fee. Here they are backing it in. Just absolutely incredible operation that would go on with that. So basically, it cost $6 million to move the building. The property itself cost about $2 million. The strength of the bricks and mortar needed testing prior to the move to make sure it wouldn't fall apart. They also had to determine what masonry walls were actually acting as a bearing wall. And one of the things that was particularly difficult with this building is that the moment they started to move the building, they also noticed that there was a vault right before the building, so there's a hollow portion underneath of the roadway. So the roadway wasn't actually strong enough in its original state to move the building. So essentially, that was filled in, and in addition to that, the roadway had to be reinforced for the weight of the structure because it wasn't designed for that weight. So the new basements required a high early strength concrete so that the foundation was ready for the building, and pre-settlement so that there wouldn't be any differential settlement of the structure either. And essentially, it was about a 1,000 tons of load that needed to be moved, and such. So that was something to consider. And as I mentioned, there was a vault that was discovered that had to be filled with aggregate and timber, so it wouldn't collapse with the house. They did crack some of the plaster in the house, but that was the most damage that was caused with it. Essentially, the home didn't change owners, but they had to get compensation for the move as well, which was an additional $500,000. Okay, so that was that case study. In typical years, I'd ask questions like this. What was a case study that dealt with conservation, transportation? This one's a great case study. It takes in so much of synthesis of all the different materials in the course, so it's a really good one. Okay, other buildings, if you go into the Ottawa district, closer to home, there's a series of buildings that certainly were brick and masonry that had heritage value, that are at risk and or being demolished. A couple of years back, I was able to go through one of these with a group of students. We were able to see some of the conditions of these buildings, different types of materials. What you see here is a cast iron column. One of the big problems with older heritage materials is they're covered in lead paints, which make it very, very hazardous with some of these materials, especially if you're doing any renovations. Here you see that they're strengthening the floor systems with new joists and such. One of the tricks that you can do when you're assessing qualities of timber is if you have a jackknife, what you can do with timber is that if you try to stab the timber itself and it penetrates into the timber, it's generally actually very good timber. But if the jackknife skirts and rubs, it's basically a sign of rot that's occurring, like wet rot or dry rot. So you have to be very considered about the quality of the materials. Some timbers, they're so damaged that you can just touch them with your hand and they just fall through. The way to check a masonry unit to see if it's, or a brick to see if it's still good quality, is to raise it up to your chest and drop it on the ground. If it shatters, it's bad. If it doesn't shatter, it's still very strong. In particularly, this building showed a series of different types of bricks. We talked a little bit about structural terracotta earlier. I'm not going to go into it too much, but still the fabrication process is very similar to masonry. Again, very popular building technique in the 1920s and 1930s. Also in the early 1900s as well. We've talked about this one earlier. Okay, so we'll take a break here, and then we'll resume talking about contemporary masonry units.